Hello and welcome to the Tennessee State University Small Farm Expo 2020. I'm Anthony Witcher. I'm an assistant professor at TSU. I'm located at the Nursery Research Center in McMinnville, Tennessee. My research focuses on improving nursery production practices for woody ornamental crops with a heavy emphasis on weed control. And today I'll be discussing methods for managing glyphosate-resistant weeds in horticulture crop production. A variety of horticulture crops are grown in Tennessee, including vegetables, small fruits, fruit and nut trees, and ornamentals. And depending on the type of crop being grown, there's different production practices that are used to grow these crops. But regardless of the type of crop or the production method used, weeds are a persistent problem that growers have to battle, and weed control has become even more difficult with the introduction of herbicide-resistant weeds. So weeds can have different life cycles, and so understanding and knowing the life cycle of the problematic weed will help you select the most effective control method. Annual weeds are weeds that complete their life cycle within 1 year, and so they germinate, grow, flower, and set seed within one season or one growing year. Annuals typically grow from seed, and a single plant can produce thousands of seeds. And so annuals germinate really fast, and can go to seed within just a few weeks. And so that's why annuals are such a persistent problem in ag production. Some examples of annual weeds include crabgrass, palmer amaranth, mare's tail, and dandelion. So perennial weeds are weeds that live more than 2 years. And so they may originally germinate from seed, but then they'll grow during the first season, and then they have hardy roots, and so during the winter they may die back to their roots. And if you cultivate or till up these weeds, basically you're just breaking up and creating more weeds and more plants. And so it's really difficult to control these in agriculture. Some of the common perennial weeds we see are dandelion, nutsedge, wild garlic, white clover, and dog fennel. Weeds can be introduced to your crops from a number of sources. Obviously, the soil has a weed seed bank that's been there for years, and so there's many weed seeds that can remain viable in the soil for 10 or 20 years. And so the more weeds that you have, existing weeds that you have, the more seeds you're adding to the soil bank, and the longer term problems you're going to have. Also, weeds can come from just adjacent fields. So if you've got fields that are weedy next door, those seeds can spread into your crops. Also, if you're introducing new soil amendments like compost or something like that into your growing operation, that could potentially be contaminated with weed seed that you don't already have. And so buying high quality soil amendments is really, really important. Also, if you're buying plants or liners from another nursery, they could potentially already be infested with weed seed. And also on your farm, if you're moving equipment around from field to field, such as a mower, a bush hog, a tiller, a cultivator, you're potentially moving weed seeds from field to field and spreading those around. So there are a lot of different sources of weeds for your crops. Herbicides are really good weed control options. If the proper herbicide is selected and applied at the right time, growers can actually save money on weed control compared to the manual and mechanical methods. There's two main types of herbicides, post-emergent and pre-emergent. Post-emergent herbicides can be either a contact type herbicide such as paraquat or diquat. These are basically burn down herbicides, and so they're applied over the plant and they kill the leaves that are contacted with the spray. There's also systemic post-emergent herbicides, and these are products that the plant actually absorbs. It's translocated through the plant and down to the roots and kills the plant to the root. And examples of systemic herbicides include Roundup and 2,4-D. Pre-emergent herbicides actually prevent the germination of weed seeds, and so this is really, really effective when you have a really clean soil surface. These are applied and can have residual effects up to 2 or 3 months depending on the product. Although herbicides are widely used in agriculture and are a really good tool for weed control, they do have limitations. Certain herbicides may not control certain weeds, and also using the same herbicide repeatedly over time can cause herbicide resistance. So now I'm going to go over the difference between herbicide tolerance and herbicide resistance. Herbicide tolerance is the natural inherent ability of a weed to survive a specific herbicide application. And so that weed may survive due to a number of factors. It may have a thick leaf or structures on the leaf that actually prevents the herbicide from being absorbed into the plant. That weed may have a physiological process that breaks down the active ingredient of the herbicide once it gets into the leaf and makes it not effective. Or that plant may just lack the target site that's required by that active ingredient to do damage to that plant, to that weed. Some examples of herbicide tolerance include selective herbicides. So herbicides such as 2,4-D, they only can kill broadleaf plants. And so grass plants don't have the target site that 2,4 needs to damage that plant. And also, there are some grass-specific herbicides. So there are target sites that grasses have that herbicide can be effective on, but broadleaf plants don't have it, and so they can be safely used on broadleaf plants. An example of tolerance, of natural tolerance, is with horseweed. So small horseweed plants, if they're applied with herbicide, they will kill the plant. But the larger the plant grows, the thicker the leaves are, and the less efficient it is at absorbing the herbicide. And so the herbicide may stunt the plant or damage it, but it might not kill it. And so it doesn't mean that the plant is resistant, it just means it has some kind of natural tolerance to the herbicide. On the other hand, herbicide resistance is the inherited ability of a plant to survive a herbicide treatment. Now, herbicide resistance can be introduced naturally or artificially. An example of artificial herbicide resistance is the development of genetically modified crops, such as Roundup Ready corn and Roundup Ready soybeans. These crops have a gene from another species. It's actually from a bacteria. And so what that does, it absorbs the Roundup, breaks it down, and makes the corn and soybean resistant to damage from the Roundup. And resistance can also develop naturally through natural selection, and this can occur when a single herbicide is repeatedly applied over time in the same field, and weeds survive. And so there could be maybe one or two weeds in that population that are naturally resistant to the herbicide. They survive, produce seed, and then over time that creates a herbicide-resistant weed population. Herbicide-resistant weeds have been around for a long time. The first case was reported in 1957. So once herbicides started being widely used, herbicide resistance started being a problem. In 1964, it was found that field bindweed was found resistant to 2,4-D. In 1971, common groundsel was found to be resistant to atrazine, which is a post-emergent herbicide, and simazine, which is a pre-emergent herbicide. And currently, worldwide, there's over 260 weed species that have developed herbicide resistance. Glyphosate-resistant weeds really weren't a problem until the introduction of Roundup Ready crops, which occurred in 1996. Glyphosate is the active ingredient of Roundup, and so once these crops started being produced, growers were making repeated applications of glyphosate over time in the same fields, and so inevitably glyphosate-resistant weeds developed. This figure shows the number of weed species that have developed glyphosate resistance since 1990. And as you can see, at around 1996, the numbers have dramatically increased. Glyphosate-resistant weeds have developed worldwide. In the United States alone, 17 weed species have been identified as glyphosate resistance. And in Tennessee, there's a reported 7 weed species that have glyphosate resistance. In Tennessee, two of the most commonly found glyphosate-resistant weeds are Palmer amaranth and mare's tail. Palmer amaranth is a type of pigweed, and it's a really troublesome weed because it has rapid growth, it's very drought tolerant, and a single plant can produce over 300,000 seeds in one season. And so all these plants that are glyphosate resistant, they're producing seeds, and those offspring will also have glyphosate resistance. And so it's just an ongoing issue. Palmer amaranth is spread by farm equipment, water, and animals, and has become a major problem not only in agronomic crops, but not also it's spread to horticultural crops. Glyphosate-resistant horseweed or mare's tail is also found throughout Tennessee. It's a major problem because it persists year-round, so seeds can germinate in the fall and then develop in the spring, and seeds can also germinate in the spring, and so it's a problem year-round. It's very adaptable to dry or wet conditions, and it can grow up to 6 feet tall. Each plant can produce over 200,000 seeds, and the seeds are dispersed by wind. So the seeds have a white tuft on them. They're picked up by the wind, and they can be carried over 100 miles. And so that's why it is so widespread and such a major issue in Tennessee. Even though it is a native plant, now we have a glyphosate-resistant version of it. So what are some management tools for controlling these glyphosate-resistant weeds? Well, sanitation is the first step for any weed control program. It is the most effective method for weed control, whether they're herbicide resistant or susceptible. So number one, remove any debris from farm equipment. So if you're bush hogging or tilling or cultivating in one field, and there's weeds present that have seed, make sure to clean those equipment off before moving them to the other field, because you don't want to transfer that seed. Also, make sure to buy quality soil conditioners and compost. Make sure you get them from a reputable dealer, and making sure that they're not already infested with weed seed. If you already have weeds in your fields, make sure to kill them or remove them prior to flowering, because the more seeds you have, the more problems you're going to have. And also try to control weeds in surrounding fields. I know sometimes that's not possible when you've got neighboring farms, but try to, at least on fence rows and other areas bordering you, make sure to keep those weeds from going to seed. We all know that over tillage or frequent tillage can have a negative effect on soil, but cover crops can be used to reverse some of these effects by adding organic matter to the soil and also increasing water infiltration into the soil. Cover crops can also be used for weed control, and they do this in a couple of different ways. And so they actually prevent weed seed germination and establishment by physically either outcompeting or outshading the weed seeds. Also, some cover crops have a chemical component that has a allelopathic effect that inhibits weed seed germination. And so that works in a couple of different ways. Cover crops can be used as a living mulch in between rows, or it can be a residual mulch where it's rolled over or crimped, and then the new crop is planted into that mulch. And so it works in several different ways. And really, the most effective practice varies by crop and production method. And so the type of cover crop you use and how you plant it will vary. A couple of different ways include planting cover crops on fallow fields, interplanting with your main crop, or actually planting the cover crop prior to planting your crop. A number of cover crop species do well in Tennessee, and some cool season cover crops include winter wheat, cereal rye, triticale, and crimson clover, while some warm season cover crops you could use include Sudex grass, soybeans, or cowpea. If you have been using glyphosate for weed control in your crops, and you have found that you've got some glyphosate resistant weed species, there are some alternative herbicides that you could use for controlling these weeds. Herbicides with the active ingredient glufosinate, which include Liberty and Finale. Glufosinate works really well on glyphosate resistant weeds, and so it will control glyphosate resistant horseweed and Palmer amaranth. The main thing you need to remember is that with glufosinate, it is a systemic herbicide, but it really acts as a contact. It doesn't translocate as well as glyphosate, and so it's best used on small weeds. And also make sure that you're using it as a spot spray or use it as a using a shielded sprayer around your crop, and make sure not to contact the leaves, stems of your desirable plants. Another herbicide that works on glyphosate-resistant weeds would be a diquat. It's actually a contact herbicide, so it's more of a burn down. So it works best on small annual weeds. And it is less likely to injure your crop if you do get some drift onto them, but you still need to make sure that you use it as a spot spray or use it as a shielded sprayer. And if you look at the picture at the bottom right, you have to make sure you get really good coverage too, because if you use it on larger weeds and you don't get good coverage, then the weeds will just grow out of it. Most of the traditional herbicides that we use, such as glyphosate, glufosinate, 2,4-D, paraquat, those are synthetic herbicides. But there are some new types of herbicides on the market that are non-synthetic, and these herbicides are made from natural compounds. And so these are another option for controlling glyphosate-resistant weeds. And so these non-synthetic herbicides, they're all non-selective, and they're contact herbicides. So they're primarily burn down type herbicides. And the way they work is they're a plant desiccant. And so what happens is you spray them on the plant, and the compounds break down the cuticle in the leaves and disrupt the cell membrane, so the plants basically just dehydrate. All the fluids leak out of the leaves, and they dehydrate, and they die. It works really well on small annual weeds, not so much on perennial weeds such as nutsedge. So if you look in the picture here on the right, on the left are some weeds that were untreated. On the right is some weeds that were treated. It did a really good job of burning down all the annual weeds, but it did leave the yellow nutsedge. And so same thing on these. Make sure you use it as a spot sprayer or in a shielded sprayer, and do not contact your crops. The one drawback to these products is that they are very costly in comparison to glyphosate. So this table kind of gives you a cost comparison of all the products, including glyphosate and glufosinate. And so glufosinate would cost about $28 an acre to apply. Glufosinate's about 3 to 4 times that at $105 per acre. But all of these non-synthetic options really are pretty expensive comparatively. So they're going to cost upwards of 10 to 20 times more than glyphosate when used as a weed control option. But they may be your only option. And so if you do have a problem with glyphosate-resistant Palmer amaranth or mare's tail, here are some pre-emergent herbicides that you could use. So for the Palmer amaranth, atrazine, dimethyl-P, flumioxazin, and pendimethalin are all active ingredients that work well at preventing those seeds from germinating. And for mare's tail, the active ingredients include indaziflam, azoxybin, flumioxazin, oryzolin, prodiamine, and simazine. When you're using pre-emergent herbicides, make sure that you start with a weed-free surface. So they only control weeds that are not present. So you got to really make sure that there's no actively growing weeds growing there. Also, proper timing. Make sure to put these down before the weed seeds start germinating. Properly calibrate your sprayer. And all pre-emergent herbicides need to be activated with rain or irrigation. So usually at least a quarter to half an inch of rain is required to create that chemical barrier. And also rotate modes of action. And so make sure to use different products so that you don't have any issues with herbicide resistance. Well, that wraps up my presentation. I want to thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me by email. Have a good day.